Thank you so much. It's great to be back in Florida. The last time I was here, I tore my Achilles tendon playing squash in New York, and so I drove my grandfather's Cadillac to his retirement community in Palm Beach, and got there, and I wondered if I could find a physical therapist, and of course I opened the Yellow Pages, and it was like physical therapist, and I did physical therapy, and it was very depressing, and I was very depressed, and I went fishing. Actually got my foot in my boot, and I went fishing on an overnight. I caught the biggest red snapper I've ever seen, and the mate held it up, and he said, "Oh, look at that beautiful, beautiful fish." Whoop, and he threw it back. He goes, "Fishery's closed." So that was my experience of Florida recently. But 10 years later, my Achilles tendon is healed. Red snapper fishery seems to be picking up speed, so I'm very happy to be here. And just as a question, who here is a fisherman of any kind? Fishy crowd, excellent. Who here is like a lunatic fisherman and fishes whenever they can get a chance? Okay, a couple of moles in the audience, excellent. And who eats seafood more than once a week? Oh my God, this is like the fishiest crowd I have ever met. All right, good, excellent. All right, we're good. All right, so anyway, I'm going to talk to you tonight about this book that came out this summer called American Catch. And writing a book about fish is not actually that easy. Writing any book is really hard. In fact, if you're thinking about doing, anybody who would like to write a book someday? Don't do it. Fish is particularly hard because you're kind of trying to figure out, this is a fishy crowd. You're obviously here for a reason, but you're trying to appeal to like people beyond fish. How do you bring people into fish? And so my previous book, For Fish, you try to find a spine, and the spine of For Fish was really the fact that 50 years ago, pretty much everything we ate from the ocean was wild. Now we're hitting the point where about half of what we eat is farmed. Huge epical shift that we haven't seen before, and that worked really well for For Fish, and it helped me kind of figure out how to hang all my different fish off of that one spine. With American Catch, it was trickier, and I was trying to figure out, I got to write a follow-up. The last one did okay. You really need to bust out a book really, not within a decade of your last book. So I was trying to think what it could possibly be. So I started wandering around my neighborhood, and in fact, what had happened is I'd moved to Lower Manhattan. Any transplanted New Yorkers here, just so I know? All right, New Yorkie and fishy. I had moved to New York. I'd always been living in New York. I had sort of lived this kind of bachelor pad existence in the West Village. But love intervened, and I ended up moving in with my girlfriend and moved all the way down to the very southern tip of Manhattan, right near Ground Zero, in a neighborhood that was once upon a time called New Amsterdam. I was very excited to be in this sort of like Dutch Manhattan, and I thought I'd find all this old New Yorky stuff and seaporty, sea chanty stuff. But in fact, actually what I found is sort of banks and brokerage houses, which if you're a writer is not the kind of place you usually hang out. So it was very depressing, and I was sort of wandering around trying to figure out, what was there for me in this neighborhood. So one morning I got up really early, as I tend to do, and I got on my bike, and I turned onto a road called Maiden Lane. And I was later to learn that once upon a time, that was actually the original Dutch name. It was De Maagdenpadje, the Maiden's Path. And it was the path along which Dutch washerwomen would take their laundry down to the East River to wash it. So I kept going, and I got to Pearl Street, Perlstraat, a street that was called Pearl Street because that was one of the original paved roads of New York City, and it was paved with native oyster shell pulled right out of the East River. So I kept going to Pearl Street, through Pearl Street, turned right, dogged my way towards the river, and I came upon this, the Fulton Fish Market. Great, wonderful, amazing place. Those of you who've read Joseph Mitchell from The New Yorker in the 30s, great, amazing, full of stories. And I was so excited to find the Fulton Fish Market. And it was just full of life and arguments and mafia and stinky things and great-looking things and delicious fish. And some people were buying entire pallets of salmon for their restaurant. And there'd also be an elderly gentleman who was buying a single fillet of sole for his dinner. So it was very, very much part of the community. So I was like, well, maybe my neighborhood is not that bad. And I thought I would sort of kind of visit it from time to time. And I did visit it from time to time. I took a little break at one point, and I took a bike ride all around the island of Manhattan. I circled Manhattan, and I came back down at the end, hoping that I would sort of complete this whole vision of Manhattan at the Fulton Fish Market. And what I found was this. Fulton Fish Market had closed, 2005. Finally, after a many-year war with the Giuliani administration and administrations before Giuliani, they finally got rid of it because it was stinky, full of mafia, and they banished all the fishmongers up to a place up in the Bronx that looks like kind of like an airplane hangar. It's a very unattractive place. And all these huge Italian guys who used to kind of dominate you at the old Fulton Fish Market, they looked like they had been shrunk down to about that big. And I remember talking to one of them, and I said, well, what do you think about being up here in the Bronx? He goes, you know where they put us? Right here. So, you heard it from the Bronx, that is where the armpit of New York is. So I was sort of, it was depressing. I didn't like that this is what had come of the Fulton Fish Market. And so I was trying to figure out, was there something bigger in this change, in this loss of this fish market? And it turned out there was, which is that the United States controls more ocean than any country on Earth. Look at all that ocean. But in fact, more than 80% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad. More than 80%. And I remember I was up at the new Fulton Fish Market, and there's this guy named Herb Slavin who, if you're in the fish business, you tend to know who Herb Slavin is, a real classic fishmonger. And I was kind of afraid to meet him, and I went up to his booth. I said, is Herb around? And Herb came out, and he's a little guy, a little Jewish guy. He was nice to meet you. And I go, Herb, how do you feel about the fact that more than 85% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad? And he goes, who's the broad? Like, without missing a beat. I was like, you can't make this stuff up. I was like, what? He goes, the broad, the lady with all the fish, who is she? And he wanted to meet her. He was interested in doing business. So it got me to thinking that this was the spine of my book. Where is all of the seafood coming from? What is this situation? What is this bizarre, if you will, American catch that we have gotten ourselves into? So that's the first question. Who's the broad? Well, let's take a look. Number one most imported seafood in America, number one most consumed seafood in America is shrimp. And over 90% of the shrimp that we consume is coming to us from abroad. A lot of it coming from Southeast Asia, a lot of it coming from South America, and as the Guardian newspaper revealed recently, a certain portion coming to us as a result of slave labor. That slaves are in fact employed to harvest the forage fish that are then ground up, turned into meal, and fed to the shrimp from these foreign shrimp farms. So huge part of the American seafood diet. Number two is canned tuna. Canned tuna actually comes to us kind of as a result, again, more than 2/3 coming to us from abroad, coming to us largely as the result of Douglas MacArthur. When MacArthur was provisional governor of Japan, he decided that something needed to be done to fix the Japanese economy, to get it up off of its knees, and he allowed foreign vessels to start going into distant waters. And with all the technologies developed during World War II, lightweight polymers, sonar, and all that sort of thing, suddenly an international tuna industry was born. And so we are sort of reaping the rewards or the punishment of opening up the international waters to a vast tuna fleet. Number three is salmon, and you would think that salmon, that should be an American staple. We have salmon here, right? Well, it turns out that the salmon situation is really weird. So we catch hundreds of millions of pounds of wild Alaskan salmon every year, but more than 80% of that wild salmon gets sent abroad. Meanwhile, the salmon that we eat, 2/3 of the salmon that Americans eat, is farmed and imported. A lot of it coming from Chile and elsewhere in the Southern Hemisphere, and I should note that salmon are not native to the Southern Hemisphere. So in fact, we're importing an invasive species that we have helped implant into the Southern Hemisphere as a farm product. Meanwhile, we're sending our wild salmon abroad. And to make things sort of triply strange, a certain portion of the wild salmon that we catch here in Alaska, we freeze it whole, send it to China. It's defrosted, filleted, boned, refrozen, and then comes back to us double frozen. And it gets weirder than that. And because if you go do like I do in the middle of the night, if you Google double frozen, you'll also see triple frozen and sometimes quadruple frozen. So there's this vast sort of fish laundering system that's going on in this country that's very, very strange. So that's salmon. So fourth most consumed seafood in America is Alaska pollock. Now, all right, that's an American fish, but I should note that about 600 million pounds of Alaska pollock gets sent abroad. Some of it comes back to us as the thing on your right, the California roll, as surimi, fake crab. Fake crab, like, I don't know if anybody a fan of Curb Your Enthusiasm, but you might remember that Larry David and his wife end up splitting because during sex, Larry can't stop talking about who can't tell the difference between fake crab and real crab. Well, anyway, fake crab is Alaska pollock, and that actually comes to us. We catch it here, we send it to Germany and Holland, and then it comes back to us. It also comes to us, pollock, in the form of that great culinary invention of the United States, the Filet-O-Fish sandwich. Almost all of the Alaska pollock, almost all the Filet-O-Fish sandwiches that we eat today is Alaska pollock, whereas once upon a time it was actually Atlantic cod, but we all know what happened to Atlantic cod. So the next most popular fish in America is tilapia. Now, to me, this really represents how screwed up our sort of concept of seafood is. There up in the corner you have the Gloucester fisherman, and he's in his oilskins. He's going out over the Georges bank, and he's going to bring you back some tilapia. So tilapia, as you well know, is a tropical fish. It actually dies in water that goes below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It's farmed entirely. We don't get any wild tilapia over here. But somehow in this sort of, morphing of icons and signifiers, the Gorton's fisherman has ended up peddling a piece of fish that originates from Africa. So that's the next one. And then the sixth most consumed seafood in America is a seafood that you've eaten, but you don't know that you've eaten. It's the Pangasius catfish. Now, this is a fish, you tend to come across this in a sort of institutional setting, like in a hospital, for example. So say you're laid up, you're in the hospital, and the orderly comes by and says, "What would you like for lunch today? Chicken or fish?" And you're like, I don't know. What kind of fish is it? Mister, I don't know. It's just fish. Well, that's usually Pangasius catfish. And Pangasius catfish are actually a very good fish for aquaculture because you can really pack them in tightly into a pond. And when you pack them in so tight that the oxygen runs out, they actually stick their little mouths above the surface of the water and take a breath of air. They are air breathing. So, ladies and gentlemen, the sixth most consumed seafood in America, the Pangasius catfish. So that's just like kind of a quick roundup. And it gets weirder and weirder as you go down the list. But what I wanted to do in the course of this book, and I'll just give you a sort of an abbreviated version. I don't have to sell my book too hard because you already have it. So, but maybe you'd want to read it. So I'm not going to do too many spoilers, but I'll kind of lay out sort of how the book works and talk a little bit about it, and we'll do a little Q&A at the end. But anyway, so to start with, I'll swing by that. What I really wanted to talk about when I first started working on this book was oysters, because I'm from New York, and oysters, believe it or not, used to be the seafood in New York City. Used to be, in the 19th century, if you said, "I'm going to New York," people would say to you, "Good, enjoy the oysters." And they didn't mean just any oysters. They meant New York City oysters. The average New Yorker used to eat 600 local New York City oysters per year, and that's as recently as 1920. So it's a very, very recent phenomenon that we lost our oysters. Well, what happened to these oysters? Well, we lost them in a variety of ways. This is actually a lithograph from Staten Island. That's actually Staten Island, and you can see the original oyster dredgers that worked the wild beds off of Staten Island and all throughout the New York Bight. And by about 1820, we had exhausted the supplies of wild oysters just through overfishing. And you can see, though, that it was really part of the culture. That's like, I think, the Manhattan Bridge. And you see right here, just underneath this industrial structure, a huge pile of oysters. Now, just because the wild oysters were gone by 1820 doesn't mean we didn't still have an amazing oyster industry in New York City. In fact, after the wild oysters were gone, we started probably what was America's first aquaculture project, where we brought in seed oysters, sometimes from Long Island, sometimes from Virginia, sometimes all the way from the Gulf, seeded our once depleted beds, and started a very, very profitable billion-dollar oyster industry. But that oyster industry didn't necessarily hold up. Now, the wild beds, as I say, 80% of wild oyster beds in this country have been depleted. And that's true not just in New York City, but it's also true right nearby. Apalachicola, as many of you know, is experiencing really, really serious declines in oysters, in large part because a lot of that water, fresh water that's needed in an estuary system to support oysters is being drawn away for agriculture and for human use. But what I think is really important here, what's happening in Apalachicola, is that basically we've been trading a seafood system for a land food system. In other words, taking away resources that we could possibly have really a great oyster industry going, and instead using that resource to grow things like sugar, things like other kinds of things that we can sell for more money. But as I said, we did have an oyster farming industry in New York City, but it also started to go downhill right around the 1920s. Why? Well, whereas in Apalachicola you're trading a seafood system for a land food system, in New York we traded a seafood system for a waste disposal system. By the time you see that peak of the oyster industry up there around 1890, 1900, we were putting in about 600 million gallons of raw sewage into New York Harbor every single day. And then you start to see the thing really start to drop off into the 1900s, 1910s. That's because people started to positively associate, not positively, but I mean, they confirmed that typhoid, hepatitis, things like that were being caused by this combination of sewage and raw oysters. And because generally it's easier just to close a fishery than it is to stop pollution, they closed the fishery. And so in 1920, oyster farming in New York City basically plummeted. And then you can see, this is a graph actually for the whole Northeast, and you can see oyster production just plummet, go down, down, and down, and down. And that little rise that you see right around 1972, that's the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act was one of the single most powerful pieces of legislation that changed the way we started to deal with the waterfront. And we are now actually starting to see a resurgent oyster industry in this country. I think it's a great thing, but we're nowhere near where we were. We're now at about 14% of historical capacity. But that said, we're even starting to see some uptick in New York City. This is actually the Bronx, up where the Fulton Fish Market is. This is a wild oyster set happening in New York City, where you can see oysters actually growing vertically. One of the amazing things about oysters, they're kind of like, you guys have coral reefs in the temperate areas, we had oyster reefs. They are grow in 3 dimensions. They are like fish condominiums. It's been shown that when you restore oyster reefs in the mid-Atlantic, in the south, in the northeast, that you can potentially double the fish holding capacity of a given ecosystem. So getting oysters back in the water, very, very big, important thing. And to me, this is the ultimate sign of New York City resilience. There's a natural set of oysters setting on a radial tire. There's now 6 oyster restoration projects throughout New York City, scientists have developed these interesting structures that do all this kind of cool stuff. But what they really like is radial tires. So that to me is New York in a nutshell. So this sort of segues into the next seafood that I talk about in the book, where you can see really this is the most accurate picture of what's gone on with American seafood in the last 100 years. You see this just decline in oysters, in American oysters and oyster harvest, and then this zooming up of shrimp. It's just like X and Y. I've never seen, there's a lot of noise when you go through data in fisheries and not a lot of signal, but this to me is the clearest signal that I've ever come across, and I think very revealing of what's going on. So let's talk about shrimp. As I said, it's the most consumed seafood in America. It's equal to the amount of salmon and tuna combined. So basically, if you're talking seafood to most Americans, you're talking shrimp. And it's interesting to note that we used to have shrimp much more prevalently in many more places than we do today. So this is a very interesting shrimp. It's called Macrobrachium ohione, or long-armed shrimp of the Ohio. And why it's called that, well, you see the long arm, but this shrimp actually used to migrate from the Delta in the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the Ohio River, a 2,000-mile round trip, and it would do it in less than a year. This was the original shrimp of the Gulf. When you heard about Cajun shrimp, this was the shrimp. Well, what happened to this one? Well, again, environmental changes. The introduction of agriculture into the Mississippi Valley vastly, vastly changed the way that system worked. I mean, originally, the Mississippi Valley was a seafood system. Mississippi, in fact, in the Native American language that it originates from, means the river that is everywhere. And literally, when you look at a map of the United States, the Mississippi drains all of the land from the Appalachians to the Colorado. So this vast middle section of the country was once a real seafood oasis. Well, what happened? Well, the corn got put in, and we started to do this thing. We straightened the river. After the 1927 flood, flood control was really desperately desired in the Mississippi Valley. And they did things like cut off entire oxbows of the Mississippi River. These are called the Greenville Bends in Mississippi. What it did is it increased the velocity of the river probably several miles per hour faster, and it made the migration of the Macrobrachium ohione shrimp impossible. And so while there are still probably billions of those shrimp in the Mississippi, there probably used to be several trillion. And the other thing that's going on, of course, in the Gulf of Mexico and around this great shrimp homeland of ours is oil exploration and oil extraction. I mean, we like to think that, geez, after Deepwater Horizon, we really learned our lesson. But look at all the oil platforms that are happening in the Gulf of Mexico. And again, it's the transformation of seafood systems into some other kind of system. In New York, it became a waste disposal system. In the Gulf, it has a very strong potential to become an energy exploitation system. So I like to be the voice of seafood, arguing out, a little voice in the distance saying, hey, there's something here that's really valuable. And the other thing that's happening, of course, the oil industry did a really nefarious thing over the course of the last 50 or 60 years by canalizing the Mississippi Delta. You can see these straight channels that are dug through the Delta, and these were done both for pipelines and also for shipping routes so that oil could be brought more directly to refineries along the Gulf Coast. And this is not just in Louisiana, but all up and down the Gulf Coast. Once you do that, salt water floods in and the marsh falls apart. And you have a situation, the red areas are land loss in Louisiana, and we're losing the state of Louisiana at a rate of about a football field an hour. And all of that land that we're using and we're losing is shrimp producing ground. Shrimp need a salt marsh in order to exist, and we are losing that at a tremendously fast rate. And in fact, we've lost wetlands around the country. In the last 100 or so years, we've lost 60% of our wetlands. Wetlands are critical to seafood. Something like 70% of our commercial seafood requires wetlands and salt marsh in order to reproduce. We are cutting out the seafood reproductive engine of our country, development by development, oil exploration by oil exploration, land food by land food. It's a very, very key thing that's happening. So why aren't we noticing it? With our shrimp. You go to the market and there's shrimp everywhere. Well, that's in large part because of aquaculture. And I should say, my previous book, and I think there's some folks in the audience who've read my previous book and know that, generally I think aquaculture can be a really good thing. There are many good things that have come out of aquaculture. But it's also, in its own way, aquaculture, the farming of the oceans, separates us from the wild systems that are necessary if we want to have viable local seafood. So these guys, Dr. Fujinaga and Dr. Lau, are really considered the founders of shrimp aquaculture. Dr. Fujinaga in Japan right after the war was a very open-minded guy, was very much, international in his outlook, and he really saw shrimp aquaculture as this way of feeding the masses. Although he started with a shrimp called the Kuruma prawn. This was an elite shrimp that only really the very wealthy ate, and they ate it in a dish called it's called dancing shrimp. And dancing shrimp, what you do is you take a live shrimp, you rip off its carapace, and then you dip it in sake and pop it in your mouth while it's still wriggling. So that's dancing shrimp. And you can see that it would be advantageous to have an aquaculture project around that shrimp because you need that live thing right there at your table. So that was the shrimp he first started working on. And then Dr. Lau, to his left, took that ball and ran with it and started domesticating things like the tiger shrimp. Remember when the tiger shrimp just appeared everywhere? Everyone went, oh, do you have the tiger shrimp? Well, that was the direct result of Dr. Lau. And he figured out an interesting thing was that, that if you cut off the eye of a shrimp, it gets very fertile. Very strange. Well, so, trying to figure out these kinds of things was really what was sometimes referred to as the Blue Revolution. Throughout the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, lots and lots of different shrimp and fish were domesticated and really changed the face of seafood. Well, the only problem with shrimp, though, is that in order to have shrimp farms, you have to farm them somewhere. And I took this picture. This is Vietnam, coastal Vietnam. And this is the way coastal countries that have shrimp aquaculture should look. These are mangrove forests. And mangrove forests, like oyster reefs, like coral reefs, are extremely important for seafood. They are intertidal, they stabilize the shoreline, they create great habitat for fish and other wildlife. But when shrimp aquaculture moved into a lot of Southeast Asia, it went from looking like this to looking like this. Just shrimp pond after shrimp pond after shrimp pond. Now, I should say that this was during the real juggernaut of shrimp aquaculture, and since this kind of movement happened, there have been very extensive laws about cutting mangroves in Thailand and Vietnam, and even in coastal China, but the damage has been done, and its damage has been really severe. And the other thing that exacerbates that whole thing is disease. This is a shrimp with white spot disease. And white spot disease is one of just a host of different diseases that come through shrimp populations. And a lot of times, the only thing you can do is to abandon the whole operation and start again somewhere else, cut some new mangroves, and do it all over again. Just, when I was working on this book, the people in the shrimp industry kept saying, oh, yeah, those shrimp diseases, we had those problems in this, in the 80s and 90s, but we've kind of got it under control. Well, cut to last year when early mortality syndrome, and I always, careful to say that doesn't affect anyone here, but early mortality syndrome, a shrimp disease, broke out first in China, I think in 2007. It spread to Vietnam, it spread to Thailand, and last year the Thai shrimp industry lost over $1 billion from early mortality syndrome. So, a very serious situation. We're, on the one hand, losing natural shrimp habitat. On the other hand, we're replacing it with, I think, a seafood system that leaves much to be desired and really needs to be improved. And I should say that once shrimp came into the picture, and aquaculture shrimp came into the picture, it slotted into this whole kind of industrial seafood system that we were starting to create at the time. So things like the McDonald's filet of fish sandwich, the Long John Silver, Red Lobster, they all come into being in the late 60s, and that's when we start to see major overfishing in this country in order to slot a lot of fish into that industrial system. And when we get into overfish situations and we can't get the wild fish anymore, that's when the aquaculture project starts to really take off, a lot of it, again, coming from Asia. And you can see this, the statistics. These are the rise of imported seafood over the course of the last 20, 30 years, just booming. And you see shrimp, tuna, salmon, tilapia, it's all going up and up and up. So that's the story with shrimp. The last creature I thought I would talk briefly about is salmon. Everybody loves salmon. But salmon was the sort of last aspect that I wanted to talk about in terms of, because it really has to do with the very intimate relationship we have with that other very important element, which is rivers. So in the Atlantic coast, Atlantic salmon are the only species of salmon that we have. There are actually 5 species of salmon on the west coast, but I'm only doing 4 here because those are the most important commercial species. Well, Atlantic salmon migrate from Atlantic coastal rivers and also from rivers in Europe, and they converge on 1 or 2 little spots in the North Sea near Greenland and the Faroe Islands. Just after World War II, those 2 spots were discovered, and they were fished hard, extremely hard, to the point of practical commercial extinction. The other thing that happened was this. So this is my native state of Connecticut, and you might think that Connecticut has a case of the measles here, but in fact, every point on that map of the state of Connecticut is a dam. There are more than 3,000 dams in the state of Connecticut. And I, being a native son of Connecticut, can say this. This is why people in Connecticut are so uptight. Their chi is blocked. If only somebody could unblock Connecticut's chi, then I just feel like we'd be a much happier place. But seriously, it's not just Connecticut. I was giving a talk in North Carolina, and I said that, and this guy came up to me and said, "No, y'all shouldn't be so hard on Connecticut because, we in North Carolina, we got 35,000 dams." So, and it's not just North Carolina. It's like we have hundreds and thousands, if not millions of dams, and all of these are obstructing what are called diadromous fish that migrate from the ocean to the sea, to the river and back again. Very important for the energy exchange. And it goes to all sorts of creatures and all sorts of coasts, as I said. The macrobrachium shrimp of the Gulf, shad, herring, sturgeon, all these things are being severely limited because, again, we're sacrificing a seafood system for, in this case, a flood control system, a farming system, industrial mill power system, all kinds of things that always put seafood last again and again and again. Well, in this last part of the book, what I decided to do was to look at one place which hadn't been ruined yet. And this is Bristol Bay in Alaska. Anybody here been to Alaska? Oh my God, whoa. This is really unbelievable. So Alaska is just a great place. It's an extremely fishy place. It makes Florida seem landlocked. It's just an amazing, as I remember, somebody said first time I went to Alaska, they say that Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. Alaska has 3 million lakes. It's just it's orders of magnitude bigger. And in fact, in this country, we actually export 3 billion pounds of seafood every year. And most of it is coming from Alaska, in fact. Alaska is this incredible seafood engine. But look at this great Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay, this is sort of southeast Alaska, or not, this is like southern Alaska. Not southeast all the way, but you can see there are no dams at all, a completely free, beautiful river system. And what's amazing about this river system, since a lot of you are fishermen, you'll appreciate this. So this is a kind of fly that you use to fish for rainbow trout in Bristol Bay. So there's so many salmon in Bristol Bay, something like 40 million salmon come into the Bristol Bay system every year. And there's so many of them that, like, we snooty anglers don't even want to catch the salmon. We want the rainbow trout. So it's a classic fishing sort of situation. So this fly that you use to catch rainbow trout in Bristol Bay is called a flesh fly. And it's actually meant to simulate rotting salmon flesh that's dropping off of the carcass of spawned out salmon. This is what makes these giant rainbow trout possible. And like, there's one, I caught that off the dock. I mean, it was like, what a fantasy. Remember when we were kids, you could catch big fish off the dock? It was like off the dock. I couldn't believe it. And this thing fought really hard for about 10 minutes. I brought it, the guide was very kind to hold it up. But the fish was so powerful and so full of salmon energy that it slipped out of his hands. And it kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going. So it was just incredible. An amazing, amazing fish, all full of this incredible, great salmon energy. And you think, well, why would anyone want to mess with that system? Well, in fact, it's a great system not just for sport anglers. This is a commercial fisherman in Bristol Bay, a really great company called the Iliamna Fish Company. It's like what's called a community-supported fishery where you can buy a share in their catch at the beginning of the year. They work through really sustainable practices, and they're very handsome, and they often fish under rainbows, as you can see. It's sort of bleached out. But it's just really great. So why would you want to mess with this fishery? Well, unfortunately, the bay as it is right now could end up like this. These are mining claims in and around Bristol Bay. And one company in particular called Northern Dynasty has sought out multiple partners. They've come and gone, but they want to develop this thing called the Pebble Strike. And it would be something like a 10 billion ton mine, about 3 billion tons of which is copper and gold. In fact, by composition, the mine is more sulfur than it is copper, so it's really a sulfur mine. But it would require the construction of a 2,000 foot deep containment pond that would be surrounded by earthen dams, and guess what? It's in an earthquake zone. So this project is now actively being debated. I should say that right now there has been a move by the Environmental Protection Agency, and again, Clean Water Act, to do a clean water action against the mine, to stop the mine, called a 404C action, which would deny the Pebble Partnership the right to have a dump and fill permit. Because this place is so remote, there's no way you can truck out 7 billion tons of mining tailings. You have to store it in situ. And what the EPA did when they did a scientific analysis of the whole thing, they found out that not only would you have to store all of it on site, you would have to store it in perpetuity. Like, that's in the scientific analysis. This toxic waste would have to be stored on site in perpetuity. So I just imagine 10,000 years from now, hey buddy, do you watching that mine? Make sure all that stuff's not, what's that? I don't know what that is. So, I mean, that's what we're up against. Well, I think that actually this really represents a kind of changing moment, because one of the first times that I've ever seen commercial fishermen and sport fishermen get behind an environmental cause was Pebble Mine. And now, thanks to them, we now have this 404C action. We're really close from stopping that mine from happening and losing potentially a 40 million fish run of sockeye. And I would hope that that would be something that could kind of inspire all of us all around our coast to think about our seafood resources, not just as commercial fish, not just as sport fish, but as part of our sort of national identity and our national heritage. So if there's one political message to this talk, I would say no Pebble Mine. That's the sort of standard logo that they bandy about, but keep it in your mind and you'll notice it crop up on the news all the time. So I thought I would end here with a little bit of a just page or two from the book itself. And you can, since you have your own copy, you can just skip to the end. I'll read page 229, so you can pick up there and just cruise to the end. So this to me is just sort of the philosophy of the book, and where I really, where it made kind of all things kind of came into place. And I was up in with the Iliamna Fish Company out on Bristol Bay, and I just spent this great time with these great fishermen. And I just, these were my thoughts. Passing up to a bluff, I looked down on the isolated little settlement washed by the foam of the Bering Sea, and thought that once upon a time, a little 17th century fishing village called New Amsterdam must have looked quite a bit like this. a modest place with its face turned toward the sea, where the fisherman and the fishmonger were an integral part of daily life, and where seafood held its own with land food in nearly every regard. What kind of alternative future might America have had if the descendants of New Amsterdam had decided that seafood, not land food, would be the country's bread and butter? Not a Jeffersonian society that relied upon the harvests of agriculture, nor a Hamiltonian one that captained banking and industry, but rather a Neptunian democracy that lived off the sea, a place where estuaries were recognized as the heart of the food system, where rivers were rarely fettered for fear of impeding the miraculous runs of salmon, sturgeon, shad, and herring, where human development moved in parallel with the protection of the near shore. What kind of society might we have formed had we not, as Melville wrote in Moby Dick, become landsmen, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks? What if instead we had become what Melville called society, fixed in ocean reveries? So thank you very much.